All right, you guys, as you can see by the thumbnail, I'm back with another one like the other one. So check it out, you guys. Before I get into this short story, I want to make a quick announcement. I know. For those of you that are impatient, just bear with me. It'll only take a minute, and besides that, this is important. I just want to extend my gratitude and appreciation to those of you that came through and for just showing your support for my dog Chewy. I let some of you know on IG how close I came to losing him a few days ago after I created a GoFundMe account. Some of you guys stepped up and helped him in a way that means the world to me. You know, for those of you that have a dog or a cat, I don't even have to tell you guys how much they mean. They're literally like our kids. And this is a road that I've been down a few times myself. Anyways, I ended up having to put him in the hospital after he got real sick. And I ended up finding out that he had diabetes and Cushing's disease. Those of you that have been following my channel for a while now know that I've never asked for help on my channel, nor have I ever used my platform to ask for any kind of assistance. The only thing I've ever used this platform for was to put out content. But I'm gonna be honest with you guys, putting him in the hospital literally sunk me. The bills added up fast, and financially, even though I've never been one to ask for help before in the past, this was the one time that I needed help. You know, I'm not going to spend any more time on this right now because I know you guys want to see this video. That's why you guys are here. But I'll post the information on my community page just in case some of you might want to help Chewy fight this battle. But again, ahead of time, I just want to thank those of you who have shown your support. You know, this dog means the world to me. He's not a pit bull, but I love him nonetheless. And like I told some of you on IG, it's not even really about the money. The gesture means more to me than anything else. So anyways, I got another short story for you guys that apparently happened a couple of months ago in a Nevada state prison. You know, under other circumstances, a story like this would be considered run-of-the-mill. But considering who was involved and how it all went down, this story is a little different. You know, in some of my recent stories, I talked about the soaring homicide rate in the California prison system and some of the residual effects it's creating. Not only with respects to how it's changed the whole political landscape behind the walls, but also with CDCR considering taking countermeasures to regain control of the system by opening back up the chute. So violence behind the walls in both the state and federal systems has become a growing trend. And in some respects, the criminal organizations that are back out there on these main lines have taken it back to the old school way of doing business. And even though this story didn't take place in a California state prison, it's still a clear example of the vast influence that the Mexican Mafia has across the board. So like I said, this incident took place sometime in mid-March, earlier this year, at a prison called Ely State Prison in the state of Nevada. And it was between a group of white inmates that called themselves the Aryan Warriors and the Sureños, who were obviously acting under the orders of the Mexican Mafia. I don't think I need to give you guys any history on the Sureños or the Mexican Mafia. They're well established, and I've given you guys a lot of that information in some of my other stories. But here's some background on this group that calls itself the Aryan Warriors. So the Aryan Warriors is a white supremacist gang that's based out of Las Vegas, Nevada. So the leader of the gang is an individual by the name of Zachariah Luz, who also went by the name Little Dog. And although this particular group is described as being another one of your typical white supremacist-based gangs, a white supremacist gang that stands firmly behind white ideology and the belief that the white race has a superior bloodline, this group is a little different for a couple of reasons. In short order, this is why. While most of your white supremacy gangs are driven exclusively by promoting their white ideology and their white supremacist views, the Aryan Warriors are also described as a criminal syndicate that deal with both Chris and Black. You know, when it comes to how some of these new criminal organizations are functioning behind the walls, most of them have taken a page out of the playbook of other criminal organizations such as the Mexican Mafia, the Nuestra Familia, the Aryan Brotherhood, and the Black Guerrilla Family. Some of them have emulated the way these other criminal organizations operate insofar as the leadership structure, some of the policies they follow, the recruitment protocols, how they implement their security, indoctrination practices, etc., etc. You know, keep in mind that almost all prison gangs are race-based, as one of their fundamental purposes has always been to provide protection and security for their own people. Even the Mexican Mafia and the Nuestra Familia fall into this category. However, when it comes to some of the white supremacist gangs like the Aryan Brotherhood, the Nazi Lowriders, the Aryan Circle, and the Aryan Warriors, to name a few, these prison-based gangs are geared more towards race. race preservation, race superiority, and again, an ideology that's geared more towards their ethnicity. The recruiting protocols are almost exclusive as well, meaning that they tend to recruit only individuals who are of white ethnicity. I would even say that the BGF is similar in some respects as well. Before some of you try to take my head off for not being clear on this, let me explain. So I wouldn't say that the BGF is exclusively race-based and that this criminal organization promotes the same type of race-based views. They're all about protecting and fighting for the Africanos that might fall victim to the other prison gangs. But in that respects, that's what all prison gangs do. All I'm saying is that the BGF doesn't preach race supremacy and that it wasn't founded on the same type of race-based political beliefs as some of these radical white supremacist groups. I'm not going to delve off into all the technicalities, but in my opinion, there's a distinction and they're a little different. When you look at the Mexican Mafia, they evolved originally for the purpose of providing protection for their own people, and in essence to act as a guiding light for all the raza that were susceptible or more prone to falling victim to some of the other prison gangs. But as they continued to evolve, they loosened their recruiting protocols, and instead of being exclusively about race, it came down to where your political beliefs and where your loyalties lied. And that's what dictated whether or not you were recruited. As time went on, ethnic diversity became more prevalent. It was no longer just about being of Mexican descent. I'll give you some examples. Mike Kudo was Japanese. Raymond Shryack was Caucasian. Nicholas Velasquez was Puerto Rican. Martin Lewis was Native American. Manuel Nerva was Filipino. Corwin Elmore, who I've talked about in some of my stories, was also Native American. Michael Delia was Italian. And then you had others like Frank Madriaga, Chino from San Diego. And Joe Morgan himself was of Croatian descent. There's a lot of other examples that I could give you guys about NF members as well. But the point that I'm trying to make is that it wasn't just about ethnicity. And these guys weren't as exclusive as some of the white supremacist groups. Don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that it makes these guys bad for being 100% about their bloodline either. I'm just simply pointing out the differences between these organizations. So the Aryan Warriors evolved in 1973 in the Nevada State Prison System. And the gang designed itself following the same concepts and belief system as the Aryan Brotherhood. A group of white inmates banded together in the Nevada State Prison System who were basically fed up with some of the transgressions that they claimed were being inflicted on the non-affiliated white inmates by the black and Mexican inmates. So after seeking a charter membership from the Aryan Brotherhood and being turned down, this in essence would have given them the ability to be recognized as an official extension of the Aryan Brotherhood. And this also would have given them the same type of influence and power. But after the Aryan Brotherhood faction from California said, no thank you, no can do, the Aryan Warriors found themselves driving solo. And at that point, they were still a loose-knit gang that couldn't find the ability to organize itself. And this is just history repeating itself because most of the prison gangs do the same thing. So the Aryan Warriors, they go on a recruiting blitz, basically recruiting anyone of Caucasian descent that expressed a desire to be accepted. So instead of seeking quality caliber recruits that met strict screening standards, they basically opened up the door and let anyone in to increase their numbers. So from everything I was able to gather, after about a year into the gang's creation, and after realizing some of their shortfalls, they appointed one of their favorite members to take over and act as the gang's official leader. So this guy was known as the Pope. He was an older guy in comparison to a lot of the youngsters that had been recruited at that time, and he was serving a life sentence. So what the Pope did is he began to reorganize the gang under a hierarchical structure, delegating leadership positions and a chain of command. This gave the gang a pecking order, so everyone basically knew where they fell in line at. He implemented rules, policies, and regulations for the purpose of maintaining order. And he also instituted a mandatory physical strength regime to encourage all the members to focus on being in the best physical shape that they possibly could. Again, I'm not going to delve too deep into it, but it's kind of interesting when you look at the inner workings and how he had this gang established. And even though he's no longer the official leader, some of his practices are still followed. In short order, this is what it consisted of. All members were basically required to agree to adhere to a manifesto. A manifesto that I'm pretty sure he drafted himself. And this was similar to a constitution or a set of bylaws and objectives, the rules and procedures that establish some of the positions or ranks within the gang. And these were some of his titles. So horn holders were basically leadership positions. Then there was bolt holders, which were basically full members. And then you had prospects, which were potential members. And then you had associates, which were non-members who were affiliated with the gang. Basically all the people that supported and assisted them. Anyways, it's basically in the same context of what we consider to be associates, facilitators, people who assist and contribute in some form or fashion. And like most prison gangs, the Pope sought out potential prospects that had a strong propensity to commit acts of violence. Guys that wouldn't hesitate to put work in and who had proven themselves on some level. In fact, in order to become a full member, a prospect had to perform a violent act that was specifically dictated by a horn holder. Once they completed this mission, this is when they themselves became bolt holders. Then, as a symbol of achievement or as a badge of honor, they would then be branded or tattooed with a pair of lightning bolts. And these lightning bolts were always put on the inside of their left biceps. So lightning bolts are another symbol that's been known to be used by the Aryan Brotherhood. So again, these guys adopted a lot of the same symbols as the Aryan Brotherhood to signify that they operated under the same or a very similar belief system. So in order to rise to the next level, which was a horn holder, they were required to commit a more profound act of violence, which was basically catching a body or an ultimate sacrifice. And then once they completed this assignment, they were given a tattoo of a Viking helmet with AW for Aryan Warriors that was always placed on the left side of their chest. So that's basically the gist of their structure and how they operate behind the walls. Like I said, these guys took pages from the Aryan Brotherhood's playbook and instituted a lot of the same ideologies and the same belief system that they've been operating under for years. Before I move on, I'll tell you guys one last part about their history that I thought some of you might find interesting. So as the Aryan Warriors were evolving in the Nevada Department of Corrections, the black inmates were paying close attention to what they were doing and decided to launch their own form of what they considered to be real warriors. So in response to the Aryan Warriors' existence, the black inmates organized what they called the Black Warriors. And they basically duplicated some of their symbols. To be more specific, they started getting tattoos of a helmet with a horn. And obviously, because of what the black inmates did, this created a lot of tension and animosity between them. So in the end, the Aryan Warriors ended up finding a strong ally in the Native Americans. And eventually, a war ensued on these three fronts. So again, this is all part of history repeating itself. The Aryan Warriors, they continued to grow and they increased in numbers. And now, feeding off the momentum that they were literally running with, this eventually began to feed their ego in a bad way. And what do you think happened after that? Like most of these prison gangs that get big and become powerful, eventually they started throwing their weight around and they began bullying and preying on their own people, on the non-affiliated whites. They basically reverted to becoming the same type of tyrants that initially led to them banding together to fight in the first place. Again, I can't emphasize this enough. This is typical history for these types of prison gangs. It happens to all of them. Once they feel like they've defeated or immobilized their adversaries on some level, they turn on their own people and they begin to cannibalize. And that's exactly what they did. So once the Aryan Warriors and the Native Americans took control of the yards, do you guys see the common theme here? It's inevitable. I know I sound like a broken record, but again, it happens to all of them. So they start using their power to threaten and intimidate the white inmates. They start taxing them and they start extorting them. The ones who were non-compliant or who refused to pay would be beaten and turned out. Imagine that. Instead of continuing to focus on protecting your own people and building your own people up, they now focused on extortion, distribution of narcotics, and building up their weapons bases. Basically, their own self-interest and the things that they could do to generate money. So all throughout the 80s and 90s, the Aryan Warriors' sole objective was to begin building on their reputation, building on its own reputation and becoming known to be one of the most violent and ruthless white prison gangs in the Nevada state prison system. Some of you might even be familiar with an incident that took place in February of 2016 at High Desert State Prison. This is when the Aryan Warriors made headline news after murking an inmate by the name of Andrew Thurgood. The entire incident was caught on some of the prison security cameras, and this was more about making a statement than it was about dealing with this guy Thurgood. The Aryan Warriors were trying to put themselves on the map, and this case would definitely help them do it. So Thurgood, he actually knew that he was about to become a target, but instead of locking it up, he took a chance and stayed out on the yard anyway. Because after this incident happened and they began investigating, they pulled all of his recorded phone calls and they overheard him telling his fiance, Cynthia Morrow, these words verbatim. My big homie told me that the dubs are supposed to jump me today. I don't know if this was a common term, but the term dubs that he used was a term that was used to describe the Aryan Warriors. So the other thing that Thurgood told his fiance is that he became a target behind his refusal to become a member. So his fiance, she tries to make an attempt to de-escalate the situation by telling him not to fight. But he tells her that he's going to stand his ground and that he's not just going to let himself get beat up. And then the following day, after that call was made, his prediction became his reality. You know, I obviously can't show you guys the video because of YouTube's policies, but I can show you still shots and I can walk you through it. So in this video, you can see two Aryan Warrior members, Anthony Williams, who was also known as Muggsy, and Tariq Goicoechea, who was also known as Torque, go into a cell that was occupied by Andrew Thurgood. So they end up staying in the cell for about 6 minutes. And then at one point, they come out and then they double back and go back in. And then about 30 seconds later, Muggsy can be seen on the video dragging Thurgood out of his cell by his legs, where he then leaves him laying in the middle of the day room floor. A few seconds later, Torque grabs him by his legs and drags him a few feet out further into the day room. You know, when you watch the video, there seems to be no clear logical reason for Torque to do this, other than to demonstrate his participation in this murking that was done strictly for the cameras, to basically get blood on his hands the same way Muggsy got blood on his hands. So after they drag this guy out to the day room where you can clearly see other inmates milling around going on about their business, they just stand there and wait for staff to respond. This is why I said that this murking was more about making a statement than it was about dealing with this guy. He just ended up becoming collateral damage and a hapless victim of the circumstances, and that's what happened. Because it's obvious that these guys wanted to get caught. In fact, after they dragged this guy out to the day room, and you can see him standing there waiting for the COs to respond, they give each other a shoulder hug in the form of giving each other props for whacking this guy, and then they prone out. So in the video, you can see the victim Thurgood laying on the floor, covered in his own blood. He had been severely beaten and stabbed 52 times. You know, occasionally you can see him move here and there as he was obviously in some pain, but the COs never made any attempt to render any medical assistance. They just casually stand there. And to make matters worse, they cuffed this guy up, even though it was clear that he was a victim. And I'm sure this probably even intensified his injuries. You know, when you get hurt, when you get poked or cut, what's the first thing that your body tells you to do? It tells you to grab that area so you can feel it and to put pressure on it. Imagine having 52 stab wounds and not being able to do nothing to ease the pain. You know, this actually ends up becoming the basis for a wrongful death suit filed by Thurgood's family. And rightfully so. After getting hit that many times, they don't even put him on a gurney. They leave him laying on the floor bleeding out for about 20 minutes, and then they force him to his feet and make him walk out, despite the fact that he's been stabbed that many times. He gets stabbed 52 times and they force him to walk all the way to the prison's infirmary where he eventually succumbs to his injuries. So that was just one incident, but over the course of the next several years, several other Aryan Warriors would also make headline news. This was just part of the building process, but again, like I said, one of the things that the Aryan Warriors continued to focus on, something that they placed a lot of emphasis on, is taking their vision beyond the walls of prison and working to become self-solvent and self-sustaining, generating money through different criminal activities such as dealing narcotics, extortion, taxing, robberies, running gambling rackets, loan sharking, fraud, and other forms of making money. You know, for those that worked under the Mexican Mafia on the streets, they referred to them as street crews. And the Western Familia referred to theirs as street regiments. But the Aryan Warriors referred to theirs as the street program. And once they started working in the street program, it didn't take long for them to make their way onto law enforcement's radar. They tried to do too much, too fast, and as a result, they started making boneheaded mistakes. So in 2009, 5 members of the Aryan Warriors, James Wallace, who went by Gargoyle, Michael Yost, who they called Big Mike, Joey Sellers, who was known as Fuzzy, Daniel Egan, who they called Dano, and Ronnie Jones, who they called RJ, were all charged with federal racketeering charges. They were all hit with the RICO, conspiracy, federal racketeering charges, and a slew of other offenses that the feds used to show that they were all members of a violent criminal enterprise that was operating in the state of Nevada. That they were all members of a violent criminal enterprise operating in the state of Nevada. And here's the crazy thing about this case. A while back, I told you guys about a case where an informant agreed to cooperate in exchange for helping him get enlisted in the military. Up until that point, that was one of the craziest things I heard when it came to some of the unconventional practices that district attorneys were giving cooperators for turning state evidence and testifying in their cases. But this one right here takes the cake. In this case, an individual by the name of Michael Alvarez agreed to testify against these guys in exchange for hormone treatments. I bullshit you guys not. This guy said that he just wanted to get treatment for his gender disorder. He wanted to get treatment because nobody knew what it felt like to be a type 5 transsexual. Huh. I don't even know what that means, but it can't be nothing good. No, obviously, there's no boundaries or limits when it comes to some of the things that these prosecutors are willing to do to get people to cooperate. This shit's beyond crazy. And if you're someone that's still involved in the criminal element, this right here might make you want to think twice about it. You know, what's even more disturbing about it is that these kind of deals are considered to be law-binding. That despite the fact that there's a clear ulterior motive to testify, that it still holds water and that these convictions aren't overturned in the appellate courts. That shit's insane. In fact, just recently in 2019, 23 Aryan Warriors were indicted again on similar charges. Another RICO operation, Racketeering, Influenced, and Corrupt Organizations Act. So that indictment was a culmination of an investigation by the task force with representatives of the DEA, Homeland Security, and a multitude of other law enforcement agencies. So both Muggsy and Torque, the two Aryan Warriors that allegedly murked Andrew Thurgood at High Desert State Prison, both of them were also indicted in this same operation as part of the conspiracy. But trip on this, they actually weren't charged with murking Thurgood until this indictment was unsealed almost 3 years later. By then, they probably assumed that they got a free one in. In fact, that case was used as a predicate offense to show that the Aryan Warriors have continued to engage in a pattern of violent criminal activity. In some of these pictures that you guys should be looking at right now, you can see both Muggsy and Torque make their first court appearance with the rest of their co-defendants. The other defendants that were charged in this indictment that you also see in these pictures were a mixture of both low-level guys and some of their leadership, bolt holders who are also known as full members. And of course, the females are the facilitators that are given the title of associates. So that's somewhat of a quick overview of how the Aryan Warriors evolved, some of their history, and some of the current activities that they've been involved in. Now, because this prison gang originated in the Nevada Department of Corrections, the Aryan Warrior stronghold is considered to be in the Nevada State Prison System. That's where the majority of their members are at. So you have Eli State Prison, and I believe this is also where they house the condemned inmates at as well. Then there's the Lovelock Correctional Center, High Desert State Prison, Northern Nevada Correctional Center, and Florence McClure Correctional Center, where they house the women. And keep in mind that even though High Desert State Prison is located in the state of Southern Nevada, High Desert is considered to be more California-based, and the inmates from California maintain control of it. So again, this prison where this incident kicked off, Eli State Prison, is considered to be one of the Aryan Warriors' strongholds. This is where they have substantial numbers at. It's like Nevada's version of San Quentin before they moved out, all the condemned inmates. So although the media didn't give any reasons why this incident happened, my source claimed that it all stemmed over disrespect. You guys would be surprised how some of the biggest and deadliest riots in prison start over petty shit. It happens all the time. Small things get blown out of proportion and it has a compound effect. You know, again, a lot of the time it's over something trivial, something like what apparently happened here, over disrespect. Someone mad dogging someone, an unpaid debt, gambling, or someone not getting off the phone and cutting into someone else's phone time. Maybe someone feeling like a kitchen server is purposely playing with their food, giving them smaller portions, etc., etc. I'm telling you, I've seen it happen over just about anything. You guys have to understand that it's a different world in prison, and they play by a different set of rules. A lot of the things that happen in prison would probably be ironed out and squashed with a little diplomacy if it happened out here in the free world. Because if someone gets disrespected or slighted in one of the most trivial ways you can imagine, Something has to be done about it. Otherwise, it'll be interpreted as an act of weakness. You can't just let things slide like that in prison. So apparently in this instance, the gang's leader, Little Dog, apparently he disrespected several sureños and it ended up escalating. According to my source, the initial event didn't even happen there at Eli. It happened when Little Dog was at the Southern Desert Correctional Center before he got transferred to Eli. So on December 8, 2021, Little Dog and several other inmates compromised their locking mechanisms on their doors, came out on the tier, and took control of their housing unit number 5. While they were out on the tier, running around, breaking windows, lighting fires, covering the security cameras, and destroying whatever else they could, Little Dog apparently used an empty trash can to flood the tier. And he did this as a way of sabotaging responding staff's entryway. In the event they tried to enter the unit, they would end up slipping and falling on the water and shampoo that he put down on the floor. But when Little Dog flooded the unit, the water apparently seeped under several doors of cells that were occupied by sureños. And the water basically ended up waterlogging some of their legal work. You know, this used to happen all the time when I was in prison. That was one of the reasons why I never kept nothing on the floor. The tier was always getting flooded, either by somebody protesting, somebody pouting, or a J-Cat just throwing a fit. You'd be asleep at night, and then in the morning when you woke up, there'd be DNA all over the floor. You know, I don't know whether he did or not, but usually in a situation like this, out of respect, you let everyone on the tier know to pick their stuff up off the floor because you're getting ready to flood the tier. But either this didn't happen or there was more to it. But either way, they got upset, and from that point, it just continued to snowball. But shortly after this happened, Little Dog was put on a bus and was transferred to Eli. So it spilled over from one prison to the next. You know, the warden in that prison and some of the other administration, they ended up catching some heat for this, because this ended up happening right after an inmate had escaped. So they ended up trying to downplay the whole incident, calling it a minor disturbance. And once the media got a hold of it, it just ended up backfiring. The warden actually ended up resigning. Anyways, again, I'm not aware of whether or not something was proposed for the purpose of possibly reaching a peaceful resolution, such as paying for new copies of their legal work, offering a good amount of clavo in the form of compensation, or something like that. But evidently, cooler heads didn't prevail. You know, I'm just speculating and thinking out the box. Maybe there wasn't nothing proposed, and maybe there wasn't a way to fix it. That's possible too. But whatever happened, it didn't get fixed. And as a result, tension just continued to escalate. You know, I've seen crazier shit happen, but maybe even the sureños demanded an apology. I'm lightweight kidding, because when something like that is requested, it's usually because they don't want to reach a resolution and they want to go to war. Because to tell another man in prison that you want him to bow down and apologize, again, that's most likely because they know he's not going to do it, and if he does, he's going to catch flack from his own people. So apparently this ended up getting to the point to where there was nothing else to do other than to strap up and take it out to the yard. And my source said that Little Dog, he wasn't the type that was into making peace accords either. Like a lot of leaders, he had an inflated ego, and I'm sure this ended up being part of the problem. But unfortunately for him and the rest of the Aryan Warriors, they seriously underestimated the Mexican Mafia and its sureño following. Maybe these guys were still riding that wave that they were used to riding, where they were just running through people. So as the tension continued to escalate, you already know what happens at that point. The leadership began formulating a plan to ambush these guys, and that's exactly what they did. So word goes out to all the sureños to retrieve their weapons and basically to get ready to take off on the woods. And my source told me that aside from these guys throwing on their state-issued blues and some of their other state-issued clothes, a lot of these guys taped thick magazines like National Geographics and books around their midsections. They did this to protect themselves from being stabbed. It's an old school tactic that was more common back in the 70s and 80s. So anyways, the plan was to target Little Dog and whatever security he had with him. Not only because he was personally involved, but also because he was their leader. And the best way they figured to do that is by isolating him, getting him when he was separated away from the main body of his people, and then mounting a scrimmage so that no one could come to his assistance. It was a cold plan, and these guys weren't playing. So instead of there being one or two shooters, they were scattered and would end up advancing in one big wave. And again, according to my source, the hit was textbook. You know, a lot of the time when something like this is about to happen, unless there's a plan to do a blitz at the first unlock, there'll be a bunch of posturing back and forth to see who's going to make the first move or to see who's going to bow down and throw up the white flag. However, the Aryan Warriors, they actually ended up ramping everything up when a couple of them ended up getting caught digging up their weapons on the yard. This was a big mistake, and it ended up being interpreted as an act of aggression. When the Mexican Mafia heard about this set everything in motion, and apparently the Sureños were told to take flight as soon as the doors opened. So that's kind of what ended up happening. Initially, when the doors popped, Little Dog came out and was surrounded by an entourage that was basically his security, and Muggsy was one of them. So there was another Aryan warrior named Lee Mitchell who was on the opposite side of the building. He was over there waiting for Little Dog, where most of their manpower were congregated. And like in the California state prison system where the day rooms are split, they were on their side of the day room where they usually sit. So for whatever reason, Little Dog, Muggsy, and 3 other Aryan warriors cut straight across the day room. They cut straight across the day room and started heading for Mitchell, where most of their people were at. But this ended up being critical mistake number 2, and it was also a perfect opportunity for the Sureños to make their strike. Because instead of using the outer perimeter to make their way across the building to their boy Mitchell, they cut across the middle, breaking their own formation. And that's when it kicked off. Without warning, the whole building erupted. So a wave of Sureños from both sides ended up hitting Little Dog, Muggsy, and the other 3 Aryan warriors that were cutting across the middle of the building. And because there were so many Sureños moving in unison, they swarmed these guys and were all over them. And this took away any chance of them mounting a viable defense, because once they scattered, they became easy targets. They were sitting ducks. Little Dog, Muggsy, and another youngster named Connor Brown got butchered. They didn't stand a chance, and they ended up turning these guys into human pincushions. You know, at the same time that this was happening, another wave of Sureños converged on Mitchell that was on the other side of the building. And even though these guys were grouping and had expected something to kick off, it was almost like they got caught completely off guard. They didn't know how to respond. My source said that some of them tried to retreat through an open sally port door that led out to the yard, but they ended up getting cut off and pushed back by another wave of Sureños that were advancing coming into the building. So it was all bad. So at some point, the gun tower starts firing off random shots at different areas on the yard in an effort to stop the fighting. And dozens of officers from other buildings and other yards, they begin responding. So when they finally ended up getting everything under control and they get everyone proned out, Little Dog, Muggsy, and this youngster Brown were mortally wounded, and 5 others had been stabbed. Kyle Traub, Daniel Andrews, Andre Gabozzi, Lee Mitchell, and Eric Janesh all had deep stab wounds, had to be airlifted out by helicopter and taken to local hospitals. Zakaria Luz, also known as Little Dog, the Aryan Warriors' second in command overall, Anthony Williams, also known as Muggsy, and Connor Brown were all later pronounced deceased as a result of their fatal injuries. You know, when this incident got to the investigative stages and the investigators started combing through hours of video evidence, they looked at the security camera footage and were able to identify the perpetrators that were allegedly responsible for committing these murkings. You know, but the whole building erupted. Every Sureño that was in that building allegedly was involved in that incident. So I'm sure it was a tedious and painstaking process to identify the individuals that were responsible for doing the actual stabbings. But after going through the footage, evidently they identified Gerardo Aparicio, Michael Buenuelos, Matthew Berg, Edgar Candelario, Oscar Cisneros, Andrew Emerich, Christian Flores, Juan Franco, Ivan Garcia, Jesus Jeremio, Christian Medrano, Juan Montalvo, Oscar Montalvo, Luis Padilla, Anthony Rivera, Ronaldo Suarez, Ricardo Salcido, Dominique Subia, and Edgar Sea. They were all charged with 3 counts of first-degree murder, along with the allegation for the use of a deadly weapon. And then they hit them all with gang enhancements for the intent to promote or assist a criminal street or prison gang. You know, I'm not sure exactly how they charged it up, but they also charged them specifically with rapidly approaching gang members as a show of force, blocking rival gang members from retreating to safety, and attempting to re-engage with rival gang members after they had retreated to safety. I don't know, maybe this has something to do with the way that they charge in Nevada, but this isn't how they do it in California. You know, this is probably from when some of the Aryan Warriors were trying to get out through the building Sallyport and they were cut off. And then from sidestepping some of the responding officers that were trying to break up this fight. You know, I've always said that I think some of the white gangs like the Aryan Brotherhood, the Nazi Lowriders, and the P9 were always seriously underrated, and that people didn't give them enough credit for being as dangerous as they were. Having them as adversaries for close to 30 years, I definitely know and have seen it firsthand myself. They're more than capable of holding their own. However, when it comes to the Aryan Warriors and this conflict that developed with the Mexican Mafia, I don't know what they were thinking or how they envisioned that this was going to end. But underestimating a criminal organization like the Mexican Mafia ended up being a serious mistake. So there you have it. That's basically what happened. And after considering how this all went down, I think it's pretty safe to say that there was no winners. I mean, the Mexican Mafia and the Sureños, they definitely prevailed and they won the war. But in the big scheme of things, where it counts, there was no winners and there was nothing to gain from this. Again, it's another example of how brutal and treacherous prison can be, all behind something petty. Something that probably could have been worked out with a little bit of common sense and foresight. So for all you youngsters out there who think that prison is something to glorify and who aspire to go there to get that credibility, you better rethink some of the aspirations that you're setting for yourselves and stop taking life for granted. Again, prison's a brutal and unforgiving environment, one that you guys want no part of. So I just hope something in this story resonates with some of you. As for Muggsy, I guess he ended up getting some of what he put out when him and Torque ended up taking out Andrew Thurgood. You know, I'm personally not a big believer when it comes to religion or superstition, but I do believe in karma. Now, I'm not sure what the final outcome was with regards to the wrongful death suit that was filed by Andrew Thurgood's family. But I'm sure they felt some vindication when they seen the news and found out that Muggsy was taken out the same way he took out Andrew. Anyways, I hope you guys have enjoyed this episode of Paradigm Profiles. If you guys liked this episode, give it a thumbs up. If you didn't like this episode, give it a thumbs down. But either way, drop a comment and let me know what you think. As always, I just want to thank those of you who continue to show your unwavering support and those of you who continue to tap into the channel. Until the next one, you guys keep pushing that positivity and enjoy the rest of your day. With that being said, this is your boy B, and I'm gone.